I'd like to thank Deborah, Tanya, and Kate, Drawing Room, Chelsea, Train for inviting me to be here today, to return to London, to contribute to the conference, to share some thoughts, to share some doubts, and thanking them for pushing me to think about something that I had never really thought before. The relationship, of course, is a clear relation. There is a clear relationship between moving, traveling, and drawing, but that's something that I have never really thought before, never devoted time to think about it, and I thank them for pushing me in that direction. And when I was invited to deliver something to this conference, I wondered what could be my contribution to it, as there are so many interesting questions raised by artists who make of both moving and drawing fundamental features of their work. At the time of the invitation, I was very involved with the work of Brazilian artist Flávio de Carvalho, who was a central figure for the project of the São Paulo Biennial I was in charge of last year. I thought that Flávio de Carvalho, as an artist that made both of drawing and walking central aspects of his practice, would give him some clues on how to develop my contribution. And indeed, his works gave him some very interesting clues, very path to follow, especially the Experiencia number 2, one of his most famous works from the early 30s. But maybe I was not apt to develop them properly at the time, and ended up leaving Flávio de Carvalho's work aside for the moment. That's why his work is central to what I'm going to say here, but at the same time it's not included in the presentation itself. Instead, I will focus on the works of two other artists who admired Carvalho's work and which will hopefully help me to return to him later. I'm not sure if today, if we have time, yes, but if not, at other time, as the paper I'm going to present here, I like to think in it as a work in progress. So I think that Flávio will come later anyway. And these artists I'm going to talk about are Lígia Pape and Arthur Barrio. But before talking about Pape and Barrio, some general remarks are needed. And I will start by making a sort of obvious statement. I'll start by saying that moving through a territory is an intuitive practice used to get acquainted with any kind of space, wherever the means used to guide or to record this generation of knowledge. That's a statement that, of course, has an almost universal validity. It was Charles Baudelaire, however, as we well know, that made this other a more precise association between walking around the city, which is a specific kind of territory, and the investigative activity of the artists that immersed in modern life. Having Paris as a privileged observation point, Baudelaire was, as we all know, an attentive observer of the extensive transformations the world was going through in the mid-19th century. He related the more advanced artistic practice of his time to the attitude of the flaneur, a typical character in Paris and in other large-scale urban centers. And the flaneur, in short, was a spectator who was interested in the flow of people and in the networks that connected and disconnected bodies in the experience of modernity, and that wove together the fleeting, decentered, everyday life of the modern city. As the flaneur constantly moved around the city, he was not looking for totalizing information on the mechanism that mold and structure the urban environment. The flaneur was moved by a more disparate and partial desire. He wanted to be at the center of the world, but at the same time separated from it, to get a grasp on a specific aspect of the unstable life of the modern world without allowing his individuality to melt away into the crowd that occupies the streets. According to Baudelaire, The artist's experience of the modern city is therefore marked by a desire to remain anonymous in the face of the convulsive and fragmented environment that he was attempting to understand and to represent. Thus established a relation of exteriority with that experience. The flaneur had this relation of exteriority with the urban experience. This may have been why Baudelaire used the life and the work of an artist identified only by his initials, C.G., to present such ideas in writing. It would later be revealed that the initial referred to Constantin Guy, a relatively obscure French artist whose work was incidentally almost exclusively related to drawings. So when Baudelaire wrote about the flaneur and the relationship between walking in the city and getting to know what's going on in the modern world, he relied on the drawings of Constantin Guy. It's intriguing, therefore, that in two short earlier essays, Walter Benjamin, arguably the principal commentator on Baudelaire's work, discusses some of the defining characteristics of drawing, in contrast with those of painting. And one of these characteristics is, according to Benjamin, the horizontality that is usually required when one gazes at drawings, so that their meaning may emerge and make sense to the viewer. Unlike painting, whose verticality sections the world longitudinally so as to represent it, drawing outlines the world transversely in order to symbolize it. Another characteristic of drawing that's highlighted by Benjamin is its inextricable link, by opposition, so to speak, with the surface upon which it's made. By that he meant that if a line drawn in an empty area suffices to define and to activate the background of a drawing, that same line can only exist as a drawing in contrast with the very background that it creates. And here you see three drawings by Mira Schendel, a Swiss-Brazilian artist, in which it illustrates very clearly this point Benjamin made about the relationship between the drawing and the background that it is drawn on. As a corollary, a drawing that completely fills the surface upon which it's made ceases to be a drawing to enter the field of painting. And that is a piece by Brazilian artist Nelson Lerner called Class Project, Projeto Aula. And these are drawings made with ordinary rollerball pens. And that in the end filled all the papers that served as support, as their support, thus becoming more paintings than drawings. And not by coincidence, they are showing that way mountain and easels, which is a support to present and to prepare paintings. So they started as drawing and then became paintings in the sense that Benjamin is proposing, because it fill up all their support. So in taking these two features together, the horizontality of drawing and the fact that it cannot fill all the support in order to be a drawing, I'd like to suggest an approximation between drawing and cartography, or at least to suggest that maps may be understood as a particular kind of drawing. Like drawings, maps are usually viewed horizontally, in contrast with the verticality of the person who traverses the territory that maps represent. Furthermore, just as a drawing does not fill the empty surface of its support in order to remain being a drawing, a map that is detailed enough to be mistaken for the universe that it seeks to describe loses its functions of guiding the traveler through a given environment, thereby becoming redundant and useless. In such a situation, it ceases to be a map, in the same way that a drawing that fills up all the support ceases to be a drawing. A map that is equal to the universe that it represents ceases to be a map. It's an aspect that was wonderfully captured by the Argentinian writer Jorge Luis Borges in this very famous and very short story, El Rigor de la Ciencia, which I bought here for those who do not know it as yet. I apologize for the Argentinians, but I brought the English translation. Well, we can also say that map making is akin to an artistic practice that includes constant movement from one space to another, such as the practice of the artist that Baudelaire associated with the figure of the flaneur. So the flaneur and the cartographer, the map maker, has something in common. Ultimately, both cartographer and artists allow themselves to be affected by what exists in a territory, taking note of whatsoever draw their attention as they move through it, and make use of the specific tools of their trades to do so. This process involves the making of choice and also the making of exclusions. It involves, in fact, the building of models to seize portions of the world. In this sense, maps and works of art may be deemed abstractions of a reality that generate their own empirical or symbolical knowledge, which cannot be mistaken for anything that's created elsewhere. They are like attempts at grasping at something that cannot be fully captured. We can even say from that incompleteness is in the nature of both maps and drawings. Maps and drawings differ, however, in one crucial aspect. While maps conceal the intrinsic limitation of not being able to fully represent a space that experienced in fragments, drawing, on the contrary, bears witness to the fragmentary nature of traversing a territory, refusing to universalize that experience. It is only in a few occasions that maps appear to abandon the desire to cover and to sum up specific ways of moving around a space, assuming this impossibility as the only way of symbolizing the urban experience. These are maps that represent ways of crossing a territory which, as it explored, it transforms those who document it. These, then, are occasions on which it would not be fitting to take up the paradigm, to take up a position of exteriority in relation to the space traversed, and in which, therefore, the paradigm of the flaneur is unable to support the idea of an artist who is also a critic of conventional cartography. And the clearest expression of such maps are the graphic illustrations of the dérive, urban drifts, produced by the Situationists in Paris in the second half of the 50s. Dérives, or urban drifts, which evoked the specific effects of a given geographical medium on the behavior of the individual, reason why they were called psychogeographical experiences. And one of the best examples of these maps was produced by Gilda, maybe the most well-known situationist, in 1957, and it's entitled The Naked City. In this map, cutouts from aerial photographs of Paris are rearranged and set in a collage in an apparently random manner. Besides that, arrows represent the many trips the author took in an apparently random manner are added to the map. Arrows represent the many trips the author took between areas in the city that held a great attraction to him, connect the pieces of this map, as if to create a new symbolic territory. This is a map that suggests a way of both registering and representing the relation between the individual and the urban space from a subjective point of view, laying particular emphasis on the fact that the individual allows him or herself to be affected by this space. These and other similar maps made by the Situationists are drawn constructions that suspend the established ways of representing life in the city, accepting their fragmented nature and the impact that the urban environment has on ways of being in the world. But although this may be the best tool for putting together a critique of the aspiration of cartography to totalize and to naturalize territories, and also a critique of the typical exteriority of the flaneur, the great form of similarity of these maps with drawings ended up undermining their capacity to enter into a critical dialogue with those who use maps to represent life in cities. In the end, it was a drawing, after all, and it was a map. So it was no accident that by the beginning of the following decade, the situationists were producing virtually no maps or drawings or making anything else belong to the field of art, thereby dispelling the ambiguity created by calling them map makers, urbanists, or visual artists. They just gave up producing these maps, even if they are critical of the conventional map making. Because in the end, it reduced, as it's a graphic solution, a graphic representation of the drifting, it reduces the experience, the real experience, to certain conventions of graphic representation of map making. So, associated with the idea of map, but nevertheless different from map making, the fact is that drawings provide support and guidance for the work of artists who move from place to place and who let themselves to be affected by the place they pass through, without having any commitment to being a companion or explanation of such movements, as is the case with traditional cartography. I shall, however, present two examples, one from the work by Brazilian artist Ligia Pape and one from the work by Brazilian Portuguese artist Arthur Barrio, in which the relationship between moving around in an urban experience, in an urban environment, and drawing as a practice inscribed in the sphere of art reveals itself to be at the same time essential and impossible to fully maintain. And this is a paradoxical and unresolved relation which may suggest the inadequacy of the terms that are commonly used to capture the experience that the city potentially contains. So I want to explore this relationship between the essentiality of drawing and the impossibility to draw in the works of Ligia Pape and Arthur Barrio. First, then, to Ligia Pape. Well, although drawing as such does not feature strongly in Pape's rich career, exception for the set of works which are unequivocally called drawings, made between mid-50s and mid-60s, there are, however, two groups of works in which the line appears as a protagonist in Pape's work, even if these works cannot be considered strictly as drawings. The centrality of the line in the works I want to present owes less to an absolute predilection for graphic solutions and more to understanding that the line, on these occasions, serves to give form and meaning to the wider project of the artist, which was to connect and to fuse the lived spaces with that created by her work. For this reason, special attention is to be devoted here to these two groups of works. And the first one refers to the tessellares, which were produced by the beginning of her career between 55 and 59, 1955 and 1959. Strictly speaking, the tessellares are woodcuts printed on porous paper that echo or that reproduce both the negative space that Pape carved out of blocks of wood and the natural, pre-existing texture of the blocks. However, unlike what usually occurs in the production of a print, the tessellares do not exist as an edition of any particular size. Each of them is a unique record of the interventions made in the wood and also of that part of the matrices which has not been interfered with. This refusal to situate the pieces within the conventions of graphic production, which signals a certain discomfort regarding precise classification of objects and concepts, highlights the capacity of tessellares, of the waivers, to move back and forward between that which supposedly belongs to the world of art and that which belongs to the broader sphere of everyday life, making full use of the veins, knots, regularities, and imperfections of the matrices, and extracted from them straight or curved lines. The artist wove surfaces of its ambiguous nature that lead observers to shift interests between what had been removed from the original material with which the prints are made and what was retained of the blocks of wood, what was left as it was before. Thus, she creates tension between the rigorously structured within constructive guidelines and the sensory and the non-discursive thing. A tension between the constructive and the non-discursive, which is a central concept of the neo-concrete movement, of which she would become an outstanding member in the following years. So the second group of works by Papi, in which drawing figures as an important, although equally unusual presence, are the teteias, or the webs in an approximate translation. The teteias are made of golden or silver threads that connect the walls, the floors, or the ceilings of a given environment. The teteias create volumes that cross and that reconfigure the space that they inhabit, like webs. Although the materiality of these constructions, the threads, differs from that of the environment where they are installed, by crossing a certain space, both physically and symbolically, these webs transform that space into a single field of invention in which that which was already given, the room, the gallery, and that which is created dissolves into one and the same thing. Yet, this dissolution is nonetheless subject to the intensity and the quality of lighting on the threads, and to the nature of the surface that serves as their background, if it is black or white, if it's the walls of a gallery of a historical building. Crucially, as anyone who has already seen one of these pieces may attest, the perceived materiality of the teteias also depends on the position of those who circulate throughout these environments. For it's their movement that makes the lines appear and disappear to their eyes, thereby implicating the visitors in the uncertain texture of the teteias. Although the earliest of these pieces of the teteias was made in 1978, it was only in 2000 that these works became prominent in the artist's output. Tessellares and teteias frame Pape's long-standing interest in creating a space, either on a printed surface or inside a room, that traverses the boundaries between what exists and what is added to, and establishes the line as a key element in her practice. Additionally, formal features that appear in both the teteias and the tessellares includes parallel lines in the diagonal arrangements and the interpenetration of full and empty spaces. So tessellares and teteias, one from the very beginning of her career and one from the late years of her career, sort of frame Pape's work, Pape's interest in the line as a fundamental instrument for her research, and the interest in dealing with what is already given and what is created by her intervention. But whereas the tessellares and the teteias can be deemed particular and concrete manifestations of this strain in Pape's work, what I will argue here is that her espaços imantados, or magnetized spaces, are its more general and abstract representation of this strain, of this interest in Pape's work. And it's this third group of works that I'd like to call your attention now, for as it's at the center of the idea I'd like to put forward here. To understand what espaços imantados are, it's necessary to say that from around 1968, Papi's habit of driving around Rio de Janeiro, the city where she lived for almost all her life, revealed to her certain places and certain actions that capture, in her point of view, the dynamism of ordinary life and an intense power to mobilize the senses, places and action which she often registered in photographs. Among these spaces that she considered to be endowed with the power of magnetism, there were those that seemed to be natural, such as the squares and commercial streets of the center of the city, like Largo da Carioca, Rua da Alfândega, and many other streets that she used to walk, to visit. The main parks of the city, for example, here is the Quinta da Boa Vista in Rio de Janeiro. It's another place that she used to deem as a magnet, having this magnetic power of attraction and the magnetized space. And also fairs, popular fairs, public markets, such as the market of São Cristóvão in Rio de Janeiro, with their collective and their constant dynamics of meeting and exchange. The streets, the markets, the parks, all of them are dealing with the dynamics of permanent exchange between the people who visit them. So in choosing these spaces, moreover, there was no moral judgment regarding what went on there. That was not something that interested her, that mattered to her. A region such as the violent Baixada Fluminense, which is a region in the north of Rio de Janeiro, that she once described as an aggressive, terrible, furious space, was also for Papi a magnetized space, which attracted her because it was a region where she could immediately identify with the tragedy of the anonymous, lost, and lonely one, and was thus, in her words, a desperate and beautiful place. Besides these natural and these permanent spaces, ephemeral activities carried out by a group or by a single individual in a public space could also, for Lígia Papi, be equally possessed of this capacity for symbolic attraction, making them two magnetized spaces. This would be the case, for example, of a group of people exercising in a parking lot, or of an individual practicing capoeira in a square, attracting and being watched by passers-by. Likewise, the work of a street magician, or in a more generic fashion, that of a street vendor. These situations, these ephemeral situations, conjured up for Lígia Papi the idea of such spaces, since a street vendor has only to turn up on a street corner, open a bag or a suitcase, and begin his speech to create a magnetic field and draw people to throng around. Just as it is enough for such a street vendor to fall silent and put away his things for the space he has created to swiftly dissipate. Although photographs are used in this context to attempt to register the attraction felt for a contingent and invented space, it's clear that the photographs themselves are incapable of doing so, since what is at play here is of more than visual interest. The photographs of magnetized spaces are, in fact, at least in my view, the registering of an impossibility, or they are signs of something that transcends the photographs themselves in an inescapable way. Owing to this intrinsic limitation of the photographs to capture what Lígia Papi was looking for, the medium in which the artist best presented these works may have been the verbal descriptions in interviews and written notes clarifying some of the features of magnetized spaces. In these statements, the artist says that she almost always moved around the city by car, thereby allowing her to visit various parts of Rio de Janeiro in a single day or night. This enabled her to observe and also to steep herself for a short while in a diversity of facts and environments, identifying those which pulsated with life more and which thus possessed the greater power of attraction. Ligia Papi also remarks that even the mere act of driving over or under the overpasses that connect different locations was worthy of her attention and interest. After all, human bodies, albeit encased in cars, were constantly crossing these points where express highways intersect. Reason why these two were spaced just as magnetized by the presence of life as those where human bodies were in fact mingling and coming into contact with one another. This work is confirmed to be a general formulation of the concern that have inspired her whole career, of which tessellaris and teteias are particular manifestations, by the fact that she associated the waving of a web in urban space with the crossing the city by car repeatedly, thus comparing her life and her work, and potentially anyone else's life, with what a spider might create if it had an aerial view of Rio de Janeiro and was given the power to cover the whole city with its net. So she associated herself with the work of a giant spider over the city, weaving a web over the city, covering the city. To the artist, magnetized space are indeed the city's vital points, among which its dwellers move constantly and pull a virtual thread that braids and coils itself ad infinitum, thus establish new and diverse ways to relate to the place where they live. A process of overlapping trajectories that does not obey any preconceived plan and that is oblivious to the difference between artists and members of the audience, thus producing a unique but also shared story. The image that Ligia Papi used to describe her work in the city, of a spider who can view Rio de Janeiro from on high, connect the points that attract it with its web, is clearly reminiscent of the work of a map maker. Like the artist's spider, people who make maps choose points in a particular territory on the basis of their individual experience or having been there. But although the image of a city as a web, seen from above, is reminiscent of the image of a map made of tangled lines, one important distinction should also be made. Because while the first image, the image of the city as a web, made by Papi, the first image can only be imagined by someone who moves about in the city, maps are an attempt to make the experience of moving through a given space legible by graphic means. That is not only imagined, but actually made by graphic means, produced a document in a single broad overview. For this very reason, maps conceal all the nuances, all the hesitations, all the discoveries that underlie its making. Maps thus neglect the fragmented operation and trajectories that brought them into being. They replace praxis with line, and in their panoptic scope, overlook the ways of being the world, which marshal the city into space by way of small-scale movements and small gestures. Maps forget of that. A well-known criticism of such a cartographic convention can be found in the diagram presented by the French sociologist Paul-Henri Chambard-Delot in a 1952 study that greatly influenced the Situationists, Paris et l'agglomération parisienne. On an ordinary map of Paris based on aerial photographs, the illustration records, with drawn straight lines, all the paths crossed by students during a whole year, almost all of them linking her home to the university and to the place where she took piano lessons. This diagram makes it clear that there is a discrepancy between the territory of the abstract city and the territory of the city as it's actually lived by each of its inhabitants. There is a discrepancy not only in terms of size, but also principally with regards to the nature of that which is represented in the map. Supposedly objective in the case of the map, the abstract city, and overtly subjective in the case of the latter, the city actually lived. Also, the discrepancy between the nature of the city that is represented, that is the objective abstract city, and the subjective city that actually lived. But although the illustration of the students' movement suggests a dense web woven around nodes, her home, her university, the home of the piano teacher, similar to that which Ligia Pape describes are her constantly practicing in the city, its graphic representation on the map of Paris ends up fully submitting to the cartographical conventions of forgetting. So movements here become just lines. There's nothing remain from the experience of making these movements on the city. In the end, it becomes, once again, lines drawn on a paper. And it's in this respect that the Pape's web-like city diverges radically even from maps that critique the commonly accepted conventions that mold they are making. After all, if photographs are not capable of capturing the ways in which a space is taken over and brought to life by human bodies, graphic representations of it, including even the most unusual maps, like this one, also fall in attempt at doing so. Another factor that reveals the nature of magnetized spaces is the fact that Ligia Pape shared many of her trips around the city with her friend, Eliot Sika, who, along with Ligia Pape herself and Ligia Clark, was responsible throughout the 6th and 7th for introducing the set of ideas and attitudes that would come to be identified as central features of the tradition of experimental art in Brazil. Having Eliot Sika along her means more than companionship, suggesting how strongly the artistic projects of the two artists were compatible during that period. In hindsight, Ligia Pape saw a great similarity in particular between the idea of magnetized spaces and that of delirium ambulatorium, a term that was created by Eliot Sika in 1978, which appeared to synthesize the relationship of the artist with the street, or the discovery of the street through walking. If in several of his penetraves, like Tropicalia, one of the most well-known pieces, most well-known penetraves, Eliot Sika had incorporated this relationship with the street as a fragment or a detail of the lived urban experience. What he was getting at with while what he was getting at with his concept of the delirium ambulatorium was different. He was looking for the idea of regarding one's own non-linear walking on the street as the work itself. Instead of representing it in the penetraves, the delirium ambulatorium was looking for ways of representing, of capturing the walking on the cities as the work itself. Like Ligia Pape, Eliot Sika also identified in his excursion around Rio de Janeiro with places and situations that held some concrete and living meaning for him, which drew him to want to reach out to them in some way. There were, however, some difference between the projects of the two artists. Rather than adopting the aerial, all-embracing view of the city that Ligia Pape, the spider, aspired to, Eliot Sika saw the city from the ground up, and one part at a time. Rather than the swift-moving woven web created by a driver, Ligia Pape, the slowly appropriation of space by walker, Eliot Sika. While Ligia Pape made a photographic record of every place or event that pulled her towards it like a magnet, Eliot Sika collected token fragments of the place that appealed to him, be it chunks of asphalt from Avenue of President Vargas, which was the one-time venue for the Rio Carnival Samba parades. It could be earth from the Mangueira hillside, a place he used to visit, or water from Ipanema Beach. In both cases, however, with Ligia and Elio, there is a similar desire to capture something that is as fleeting in nature as its reclamation, its retaining is indispensable. So it's sort of trying to capture something that's always escaping, both in Ligia and Hélio's cases. One with photographs and the other with collecting this piece of the city, these fragments, these tokens of the city. So seeing the city as a web, one that all its inhabitants wave without knowing what form of dimension it will take eventually, like an imaginary map that's forever under construction. So seeing the city as a web is echoed in the act of making grooves in a material that already features so many depressions and scratches in, like in the tesellares. Or is echoed in that of constructing with threads a space based on pre-existent spaces, like in the teteias. Whereas the city web conditions and limits one who wants to cross it, the city conditions the traversing of anyone who wants to cross it. The city is also flexible enough to be traversed, shaped, and expanded, just as a block of wood at once restricts and accepts to be carved out, or as an empty room both resists and offers itself to be reinvented with lines. Such understanding allows us to better establish the relation of Pape's work to drawing, less an instrument for projecting or for recording a specific thought or gesture. Drawing would appear to be a creative act upon the places we live in which bodies draw lines and wave paths in order to construct that which does not yet exist, to construct that which cannot yet be named, to construct that which cannot yet be represented. So drawing to Ligia Pape is this instrument for drawing something new that even she doesn't know exactly what to do with. And now to Arthur Barrio. Between the late 60s and early 70s, Barrio led the groundwork for the guideline of his artistic practice, including the use of perishable materials and his own body as an agent for the production of meaning. And among the actions which are central to his practice are what he called situações, which started in 1969, in which objects are arranged in a certain way and bodies are set in motion by diverse means, thus modifying a place or a moment. These are photos from different situations from 69, 70 that Barrio carried on. So the idea of the situation is that she arranged things, objects, and bodies in a way that changed the way that a place or a moment was lived by anyone who was there. As now, the artist's displacement in the artist's displacement in the city, the movement of the artist in the city, is also an essential part of several of these situations. And drawing is a medium he uses to both outline and to document the situations. As an outline, drawing, along with writing and collage, is an important part of what Barrio calls cadernos livros, or folder books, a support in which he records the impulses that foreshadow the situations, albeit irremediably incomplete and fragmented. It's not an artist's book, but it's something, it's like as the artist's studio, almost, these folder books, in which he foreshadows what he plans to do in the future. As documentation, however, drawings, along with writing and photographs, but without the emphasis given to these other media, are part of what the artists call registros livros, or books records, which potentially lead the works to a variety of places and moments beyond the context in which they actually happened. So he had these folder books and also the books record, in which, in this case, he projected the work, and the other he tried to register, to record what he has done through drawing photographs, writing, collage, anything else. It should be also noted that in this idiosyncratic manner in which Barrio designs and punctuates his writing notes on these supports makes his texts very similar to, and in some cases almost indistinguishable from, the drawings themselves. His writing is almost a kind of drawing as well. However, neither the fold books nor the books record may be mistaken for the situations to which they refer. They always fall short of or move beyond them, for the situations do not fully allow themselves to be imprisoned by image, writing, or photographs. Although they exist in embryonic form in the fold books, and as a plausible memory in the books record, the situations are events that exhaust themselves even as they are taking place, and for which all anticipation is vague, to say the least, and all documentation is always insufficient or ineffective. Of various pieces produced during this time, two specific works should be cited here for being extreme examples of this relationship, as central as it is tense, between the displacements the situation engender and the ways Barrio uses various other media, drawing included, to both project and to a lesser extent to document them. And the first piece I want to talk about is the one called Death, Situation, plus B plus Streets. A work made in May 1997. In this work, Barrio prepared 500 plastic bags full of the most varied waste, dejecta, and fluids, including blood, nail clippings, saliva, mucus, hair, urine, piss, shit, snot, bone, toilet roll, used or otherwise, period pads, used cotton wool, wipes, sawdust, food leftovers, paints, snippets of films, etc., etc. This is a list, part of a list that he made describing everything that was on these plastic bags, inside these plastic bags. Then he abandoned these unspecified volumes at different locations throughout Rio de Janeiro, on streets, on sidewalks, on parks, on lakes, some of which were full of people. Some of these places were full of people and others were empty. Some were central, some peripheral. The random character of the place is chosen to their distribution, mirroring the indistinctness of the contents of the bags. So there was nothing planned in the places where about the places where the bags were being deposited, as reflecting this indistinctness of the contents of the bags. Each of these bags would function, according to him, as a deflagrational object of psychoorganic situations of spectator involvement. That's his words. In which body and mind are understood as undivided receptor of stimuli. In addition to articulating various locations throughout the city without any discernible hierarchy, locations which were marked as points in a map, the action led to a full and synesthetic participation of the passers-by confronted with these bags, whether in their tactile, olfactory, gustatory, visual, or auditory aspects, or in the ability to evoke pleasure or repulsion, stimulating dormant or even unimagined connections. The sensory disorientation potentially caused by this deflagration on objects exposes the fragility of the limits within which one understands and organizes life, even in its most ordinary dimensions. Faced with the bags full of things that do not symbolically fit together, and which supposedly ought not to be where they were found, the passers-by experience the undoing of the classificatory categories that separate garbage from non-garbage, that separate food from inorganic matter, separate what attracts interest from what repels it. these people are, at least momentarily, faced with an act of resistance to a social order that reigns in both public and private domains. The nature of the bags abandoned by Arthur Barrio throughout the city is something akin to abjection, a concept that, in the field of psychoanalysis, designates not a specific materiality, but a condition in which meanings collapse. However, one must not confuse that rejection of classifications, hierarchies, and stratifications with an outright abdication of all action toward constructing something distinct from what already exists. Implicit within the shuffling of consensual norms is the infinite possibility of creating something new, as no single partner or model of understanding a given situation can, under this situation and these conditions, exercise hegemony over any other. If a declassifying operation is destructive toward the norm and toward the rule, it is therefore inevitably disorienting. It is also potentially a bearer of the new, symbolizing simultaneously danger and power. There is therefore a positivity to Arthur Barrio's work that is the flip side to its negating assertiveness. What the work sets in motion is not a rhetoric of teaching something, but rather a pedagogy of unlearning everything one thought one knew. This may be why the media employed to anticipate or to register the situations play a lesser role in elucidating them than they do in affirming them as part of a body of work that builds up something new by breaking down conventions. So, although different and not to be confused with situations or with the situations themselves, the photo books and the book records are paradoxically fundamental to their production because they give notes of this uncertainty that permeates Barrio's works. That's the impossibility of classifying Barrio's works. And the work in which this aspect is most unequivocally present is in 4 Days, 4 Nights, also from May 1970. Instead of presenting himself, as in previous situations, as the one who proposes and who observes a process in which the other, whether a passerby or a museum visitor, is a receptor of his work, in this piece, Barrio uses himself as the object of his action and uses the city as his expanded support. By dedicating himself to wander through the streets of Rio de Janeiro for an indefinite period of time. While in the previous work, Barrio still maintained a relation of exteriority to the environment where he acts, here he's from the outside, submitting himself, and not the others, to the power the city possesses to crush certainties. What mattered in this roaming and confrontation with the unexpected was to escape the physical, social, and moral conditions that define, in every circumstance, what is possible or what is acceptable, and thus equip himself to support the limits he saw as impinging upon his artistic practices. So, he decided to abandon himself to, or let himself to be affected by a territory saturated with sensory stimuli, so that the conventions that organize life could be challenged or even be undone by a deregulated subjective, one capable of perceiving what was previously imperceptible. So he considered this work, 4 Days, 4 Nights, as a way of liberating himself from all type of conventions that molded his work up to then. So it's a crucial work. It was a crucial experience for him because he thought that from that experience of perambulating throughout the city for an indefinite period of time, without knowing what's going to happen, something new would happen to him, and something very different would emerge for his work from then on. We should mention here that the apparent similarity and fundamental difference between 4 Days, 4 Nights and the practice of the Rive, of the urban drift, developed by the Situationists in the mid-50s. Defined as a technique for passing rapidly through diverse environments, the derive presupposes the effects of a given geographical environment on the emotional behavior of individuals as they wander aimlessly through urban space, exactly as does Arthur Barrio in 4 Days, 4 Nights. However, the crucial difference between the situationist urban drift and Barrio's perambulation lies in the expectations of control over the consequences of moving about in a given physical and urban environment. For the situationists, the random and casual aspects of the derive in no way cancelled out the mastery of the psychogeographical variations produced by knowledge and calculation of their possibilities. One corollary of this is that the role of chance in the derive is only relevant as long as psychogeographic observation is not fully consolidated, gradually waning in importance as more derives occur and further knowledge about a particular space is generated. So for the situationists, the derive was a way of getting knowledge about a certain space. And the more derives were made, more knowledge was generated, and so the space could be appropriated in a particular way, taking into account the geographical, the psychological aspect of that space. For Arthur Barrio, however, what lay at the heart of 4 Days, 4 Nights was precisely to allow himself to be affected by that he had no kind of control whatsoever. He was driven in his confrontation with urban space by an attempt to free himself from what he knew and a desire to chance upon things that he did not yet know, adopting, as he put it, the language of a shipwreck. While it can be said that for the situationists, the derive sought to redefine the subjective of the drifters in relation to an external environment that they believe could be progressively known, the work of Arthur Barrio can be seen to be a struggle with his own subjectivity, challenging the boundaries between the individual walking and the environment he is walking through. No surprise, therefore, that although the route had been to some degree planned and now structured in different segments, the execution of the work itself gradually led Barrio to abandon all his plans. What signaled the end of one segment of the journey and the immediate beginning of the next for the artist was the recognition that some events, meeting someone or come across a certain scene, raised for him a striking question. His wandering through the city would therefore be made up of a series of movements between points that had in common their capacity to interrogate him about something, as if Barrio were randomly mapping people and landscapes who might test and challenge his relationship to the city. Setting out with no money and determined to speak as little as possible, Barrio experienced many sensations, both cumulative and contradictory, and a loss of control to which body and mind responded nevertheless with growing passivity. This experiment, whose results of which could not be estimated beforehand, brought together and mixed the drives of life and death, and was interrupted only when physical and psychological exhaustion prevented the artist from proceeding 4 days after he had begun. As the hours and days passed, however, the gradual loss of awareness of what he was passing through ended up subverting the intended division of the walk into recognizable separate stretches. And the more the artist strove to fix in the memory the most striking features of each part of his journey, the more the very confrontation with the city produced a gradual process of forgetting. As a result, there is for Arthur Barrio a gradual muddling of places in the city and the time, and a gradual muddling of the time it takes to get to them, as if the map he was tracing out with his body were undergoing at the same time a process of inevitable disintegration. Although Barrio had considered producing an extensive book record of 4 days, 4 nights, the decision not to make notes during the project, thereby breaking down the distinction between the one who proposed the work and the one who received the work, contributed to the impossibility of committing to memory the sensations experienced therein. And in the absence of images or texts, and given the inability to remember for certain what occurred during the work, instead of a book record, he published a folder book on the action, as if the lack of traces required a more investigative medium, which would help him to understand what had occurred. Although it's divided into 2 volumes, all the published pages of the folder book were left blank, marking the piece as a borderline work in which the features of Barrio's self-imposed activity are placed under scrutiny. 4 Days, 4 Nights is therefore an action that evinces the entropic nature of the artist's work, which was already present in other situations in which he made use of perishable materials. In 4 Days, 4 Nights, new knowledge is generated only, and paradoxically, at the expense of recording and communicating this knowledge fully. Drawing annuls itself, therefore, so that something new may take place. It therefore seems appropriate that during the time he spent walking the streets of Rio de Janeiro, Barrio left many of the folder books he had produced in the preceding years on the roofs of the cars parked in various parts of the city. These discarded volumes contained drawings and writings, which left randomly to mark out a map of these wanderings, a map that was never made, may have been destroyed by the natural elements or picked up as trash. Had a map of these wanderings of 4 Days, 4 Nights been drawn, it would not perhaps have been one that showed the physical movements of the artist, but rather one that noted his varying psychological states in his confrontation with the city. And then to the conclusion. The presence of drawing in the work of Ligia Papi and Arthur Barrio is ambiguous. And here we have two early works, maybe the very first Tateia that Ligia Papi made in 1978 at Parque Lage in Rio de Janeiro, and one of the first situations that Barrio created in 1969. And there is a striking similarity between the 2 pieces by Papi and Barrio. So the presence of drawing in the work of these artists is ambiguous. It's neither conventional nor evident, yet it's of great importance to the understanding of their practices. It's therefore a paradox that both in magnetized space and in 4 Days, 4 Nights, possibly the most radical examples of what is specific and original in the practice of these artists, not even the most restrained kind of drawing is visible. In the case of Papi, drawing becomes immaterial precisely when the idea of acting upon what already exists, transforming it into something new, presents itself as a gesture of full immersion in everyday experience, like the magnetized space. Drawing disappears when it no longer manifests itself as grooves etched in wood and then printed, or as lines stretched like threads in space, like in the Tateias. By virtue of its very impossibility, drawing is erased when it becomes a web to be woven directly onto the city. For Barrio, on the other hand, there is a lack in drawing at the point in which the artist proposes, by wandering aimlessly throughout the city for several days, when the artist proposes to free himself from all condition of mind and body, in search of something that could not even be named. Because it's inadequate, drawing disappears when it was expected, if one takes into account Barrio's previous work, to be a protocol for projecting or for recording ways of being the world that the artist sought to invent. Like map makers who move around the city, one by car, the other on foot, and who draw and make notes about what they see and feel in this horizontal space, the city, Papi and Barrio tackle things that cannot be represented by any graphic device. The dense and tangled web imagined by Papi and the blank sheets of paper produced by Barrio are equally eloquent signs of such an impossibility. Each in their own way, Papi and Barrio suggest, in the work discussed here, the boundaries of their artistic projects of fusing life and work, the former reinventing the later and dispensing with all the rest. These are works that, faced with the impossibility of becoming drawings, serve as a model for something that has no name as yet, but that is invented nevertheless. And perhaps that's the reason why both Papi and Barrio took so long to decide the status of the experiments in their work. Paradoxically, drawing matters here because, in its absence, it affirms what art is capable of. Thank you.
In taking this particular reading of Barrio's work, you haven't, I'm going to focus on something that you haven't raised, which is the political context for these actions. And therefore, when you're stressing which I think you did, this sort of randomness and passivity of these actions and his relationship to the city, from my understanding, when people have written about the reasons that he made these interventions within the city, had to do with the moment of the dictatorship, that political motivation might give you an alternative reading that is much more to do with a very strategic and deliberate intervention within the city. And so I just wanted to sort of ask you about that particular take on his work and your
No, that's true. Some of the situations Barrio created in the early 70s were made in the context of dictatorship in Brazil. And it was, like many other artists, he tried to respond to that situation in a critical way. And one of his most well-known pieces is called Situation TT1, which is one of the photos that has the piece is that one, in which he made these bundles of made of meat and bones and throw them away in a river next to Belo Horizonte, capital city of Minas Gerais, without making any notes of that. And then the bundles attracted the attention of the police, of the people. Hundreds of people were attracted by that, and the police came and investigated, because at the time it was sometimes bodies appeared like that, but there were people that were sequestrated, tortured, and killed by the political police in Brazil. So that was a sort of an intervention that had this meaning, had this, because they were made in that context. However, that's a standard understanding of Barrio's work. But if you think that, the same work, this work is divided in three parts. Barrio divides this work in three parts. The first one is the preparation of the bundles. The second one is the action itself. And the third part is an action that he did nearby this area, an action that's similar to that photo. It's not exactly that, but an action that he made with the toilet paper. And one wonders, why is that? What's the relationship between the bundles, this very political work, and that toilet papers throw away or in the river? And I began to think that that besides this political aspect of Barrio works, very localized, very precisely, historically localized, the real political aspect of Barrio works is this idea of declassification. And he was, if you look for other works by Barrio at the time, the main focus of his works was to declassify things, to mix materials, the ones that were perishable, the ones that are precious, and to mix into the everyday life, and to put together an action that could be read as readily political, and other action that could be read as purely poetical. And I think that the most political action of Barrio was to insist in the declassification of things, and thereby open up a lot of new possibilities for us to think the world anew, to open up for us the possibility of looking at the world in a different way. So, although I agree with this, I think that it's possible, this specific interpretation of this piece specifically, if you look throughout the works that Barrio made at the moment, you will see that there is something more there, that move beyond that interpretation. And the same goes to other artists at the period, like Silvio Meirelles, for example, with that work that was shown here at Tate, the Red Drift, de Gil para o Vermelho, in which there is this very political interpretation about the political moment Brazil was going through, because everything's red, it's blood, etc., etc. But also, Silvio also claims that the work is not only about that. It's about an investigation of this sensory experience, the way that people change the way he feels about the environment when he's immersed in a situation that's completely red. So I think that these interpretations are possible. I would be right, but they are not apt to make all that is involved with the work.
By the way, it was a fascinating talk. Thank you very much for that. Would you say that one of his main motivations in wandering in the city in the day and the night was to overcome his fear of being attacked and being murdered or robbed? Because you spoke in fairly general terms about the significance of this work, but it seemed to me that was a very powerful aspect of it. Nothing terrible happened to him, which was interesting for him in overcoming these fears.
Yeah, well, what you know about what really happened in 4 Days 4 Nights is mostly from an interview that he gave in the 80s in 2001 about that, and a short text he published in late 70s, about 8 years after the act itself, the action itself. And he claims that and also interviewing him about it, he claims that he doesn't remember very well what happened. He had this diffuse fear of that something could happen with him, but from the moment on, he sort of forget about everything. He couldn't. He was completely involved in the city. He was almost like entering a dreaming walking. So he has just collected some images from here and there. He remembers a situation where he went through a train line, and then he encountered a group of people sleeping on the floor, but they were very, very nice with him. They didn't. Maybe he said that maybe they were afraid of him because he looked so weird at the moment, because he was 3 days walking around. He was dirty. He was completely hallucinated. So, by the way, although it's not a very central aspect of the work, he says that before he started walking, he spent 2 days smoking marijuana a lot in order to get started to the walk. But of course, after 2 days, it's all gone. But I don't know if I answer your question, Guy. But it's difficult to say if he feared. Of course, he feared in the beginning. It was a new experience to him to walk in the parts of the city that he didn't know over the night. And he remembers a situation in which he lay down on the street and suddenly saw the stars and spent hours looking at the sky. And he remembers some people that passed it through and said, oh, this is done. This is no way for this one to recover from that, so it's completely done. So his reminiscence of the work are almost made of these flashes. There's no really way of capturing what really was going on, based moment by moment.
Okay, now I see 3 more. Thank you. Moacir, thank you for a wonderful talk. I just wanted to perhaps draw a question to you in relation to the question about ways of reading practice. And I'm curious about the distinction or the link, but the distinction between reading a work in terms of its political situation, if you like, or contextualization, and how that may differ or move away from the other component or essence, which is about the sort of poetic engagement with the moment, if you like. And I am curious about that because, of course, in theory, it potentially sets up an interesting discourse around the purpose or usefulness of anthropology as a system by which we can begin to look at the practice of artists, specifically those who come or fall outside of a Western canon, if you like. And that seems to be a kind of habitual folly, certainly from my experience of these things in a Western context. So I'm just curious about that because I think that for me, the anthropological perspective on reading does become problematic precisely because, as you've said, Barrio was interested in breaking down the definitions, creating a new language. And I wondered what you felt about that in relation to what is currently quite a significant question in terms of the relevance of anthropology, in terms of a tool, in terms of offering itself up as a tool by which to look at and analyze and think, critique art practice.
Thank you. I don't know if I really understood, but I would just say that in general, I think that you have to read the work. I think you have to look at it, try to listen to it, and to understand it in its all terms. Although anthropology or sociology or philosophy or art history, but that matters, all help us to sort of get acquainted with what was going on at that moment, at that particular work. I think you have to be generous and to trust what you are seeing and what you are witnessing, what you are receiving from the artists. And because sometimes you risk mold or change the work in order to adapt it to our background. Of course, any of us I have a theoretical background. I'm an economist, and then moved to arts. So I think the world, I see the world through a certain lens as anyone else. But you have to be cautious about that, because otherwise, although anthropology is very useful to understand the work, can make a very strong, heavy bias when you try to deal with what is specific about it. That's why I prefer, when analyzing Barrio's work, to move away, move beyond this political reading of it. Although it's right in a sense, it's correct in a sense, but it's limited anyway. So I prefer to to go for a broader understanding of what's going on there.